Hello, everybody. My name is Stuart. Welcome to the channel. And today we are going to be looking at who I feel are some very underrated prospects within the Minnesota Wild organization. So, just laying out some ground rules, I will look at one prospect per round. So, one out of the first, one out of the second, so on and so forth. Um, and I'm going to try and avoid players that are pretty consensus within the top 15, top 10 prospects within the organization. So the list that I'm going to be referencing here is from McKeen's Hockey. I love what they do over there. They do really good evaluations of prospects. These lists are really well done. And so for reference, their top 15 lists that I'm also going to use that I used as my criteria are Jesper Wallstedt, Zeev Buium, Danila Yurov, Riley Heidt, Liam Ogren, Marat Kuznetsov, Ryder Ritchie, Carson Lambos, Damon Hunt, who in this case I'm swapping for David Jiricek because obviously Hunt went to Columbus in that deal and Jiricek would undoubtedly fall into the top 15 prospects. Charlie Stramel, Aaron Kivaharu, Ryan O'Rourke, Hunter Height, Caden Bankier, and Rasmus Kumpalainen. So those 15 guys I generally tried to stay away from. One thing that you may note is that all of the Minnesota Wild's first round prospects are in that category. So, uh, including David Jiricek, who we're swapping for Damon Hunt, obviously picked by Columbus, but still in this prospect pool now. But Zeev Buium, picked 12th overall last year, he's on that list. Charlie Stramel on that list. Ogren and Yurov both on that list. Wallstedt and Lambos both on that list. And then you're getting to guys like Marco Rossi, Matthew Boldy, all guys that have panned out at the NHL and are actively playing in the NHL. So for the first round guy, I would like to talk about someone I think doesn't get as much love from fans in the organization when I think that he really should. And that guy is Charlie Stramel. So Stramel is a 6'3" right shot center. Obviously, as I mentioned, picked 21st overall in the 2023 NHL draft. He is a very strong two-way player. He is hard nosed. He has some fantastic puck skills for a guy of his size. He's able to win battles along the boards. He's a menace in front of the net. He reminds me a bit of Eriksson Ek as a player, and I think that would be the best route to kind of develop him in when he hits the NHL level. Um, Also, he is from Minnesota. There are a couple guys on this list that are Minnesota natives. Uh, it seems like the Wild do kind of like drafting guys out of the state, which makes a lot of sense. It's a huge reservoir of prospects to pull from. But I think it's kind of cool that it's a Minnesota kid drafted in the first round, probably has a bright future on this team. Um, as for Stramel's play, he has had a massive resurgence in his level of play here after transferring from the University of Wisconsin to Michigan State. So, obviously, in the 22-23 season, in his 33 games played, he had 5 goals, 7 assists for 12 total points. He played really limited minutes on what was one of the worst teams in Wisconsin's collegiate history. They were bad. They wiped the slate of their coaching staff. They brought in Mike Hastings for the 23-24 season. And Stramel outwardly took a step back. In 34 games, he had 3 goals, 5 assists, 8 points. And so that did spark quite a lot of conversation among a lot of fans over, well, was this, is he a bust? What I would like to point out is Mike Hastings does have a track record of playing older players. And so Strammel was consistently getting butted out by 23-year-old guys that were still playing under COVID eligibility. And so Hastings would play them up the lineup. Strammel would get put down to like the fourth line. He was playing limited penalty kill, much more of a defensive forechecking role. And so he didn't generate a lot of points, but when he was given the opportunity to show a little bit of those puck skills and actually play some offense, he looked very nice. And so I think the stat line there is a little bit misleading as to where his level of play actually was. And then obviously he goes to Michigan State, and he's in the first 20 games here. He has 6 goals, 9 assists, 15 points. He's most he's had in anywhere in his level of hockey, or anywhere he's played in college. And he's also a plus 10. He's playing as a top 6 center. Um, he's playing phenomenally on both ends of the ice. Um, and I think that some people are starting to come around on him, but I do think a lot of fans still hold that draft night against him because of the guy who went, I believe, 2 picks after him in Gabe Perreault, to the New York Rangers. So Perreault, undeniable puck skills. He's a fantastic scorer, great passer. However, I I believe I understand why Brackett uh, liked Strammel a lot more. And the reason being, in part, is that Perot adds a high level player in a part of the prospect pool we already have a lot of, which is skilled wingers who are maybe a little bit smaller. Um, and you can lump guys, some other guys into that list who are a little bit undersized at center, who probably end up being wingers at the NHL level. But, um, excuse me. But Perot also gets bumped off the puck, I feel, a little bit too easily. And despite his great production, I question whether or not he can truly drive play at the NHL level, or whether or not he is largely a product of his line mates. So last year he was playing with Celebrini, and I believe Will Smith spent time as their other wing. This year he's playing with James Hagens, and I think they've swapped that other wing a couple times. I could be wrong, but he plays with the best of the best over there in Boston, and so I think when he gets to the NHL, especially with the Rangers, if they don't immediately play him in the top 6, I think it'll be a bit of a rude awakening, and I wish him all the success. I think he will be a good NHL player, but I think Strammel adds a player to the Minnesota pool that Minnesota was lacking in, which is these big body two-way centers that can play solid defensively, but also can score. So those Eriksson Ek, those Mikko Koivu type players that before this draft they really didn't have any, and then they picked 2 right off the bat with Strammel and to a little bit lesser extent Kumpalainen. But I see Strammel as being a kind of pretty high end middle 6 center who can play up the lineup as he develops, and I think if they can develop him into kind of that Eriksson Ek type player, that would be phenomenal for them. I do think he should go back to college though for another year, kind of finish refining his game, and then make the jump probably the year after. So the second round player that we're going to talk about today is Rieger Lorenz. He is a 6'2" left shot winger out of the University of Denver. The Minnesota Wild picked him 56th overall in 2022. And again, he kind of fits that mold of he's a stronger two-way guy. He forechecks very well. He's able to play pretty solid defense, but he also does have some pretty solid passing, some pretty nice passing skills, and some great offensive sense to his game. And so the reason I wanted to highlight Lorenz is that he had a huge jump in his production uh, at the University of Denver in his sophomore season. So obviously his freshman year there in 22-23, in 37 games he had 9 points, 2 goals, 7 assists. He was a 0 on his plus minus, pretty typical freshman numbers. But then his sophomore year, in his 44 games played, he had 16 goals, 14 assists, 30 total points, was a plus 21. So he kind of showed this side to his offensive game that we hadn't really seen before, at a higher level than he had ever shown any of that prowess at. And now this year he's off to a much slower start. 20 games, 3 goals, 2 assists, 5 points. Um, but I think that this is kind of a result of he's getting deployed a little bit more defensively. And he obviously has had some changes to his lines. And so I think it's less of a indication of his play as a player and more of a he's getting a different deployment on the ice. And so he's also teammates with Zeev Buium over there. So it's kind of a fun duel to see right now in college hockey, and then in the future, potentially see at the NHL level together. I see him as third, fourth line guy who can forecheck, play both ends of the ice, uh, and I think he will need probably a couple years between the NCAA and the AHL to develop. But I think he is a guy that obviously he gets overshadowed a bit by other second round picks that we've made, uh, notably Riley Heidt, who's been lighting it up in the CHL. But I think Lorenz is a guy that is kind of sneaky and is a little bit similar to the guy that I'm going to talk about here for the third round, but is a much bigger built player than that guy. So I like Lorenz. I think he has a lot of good potential here for the NHL. So our third round player we're going to talk about today is another left wing who currently plays in the AHL for the Iowa Wild in Michael Milne. So he is a little bit smaller than a guy like Rieger Lorenz. He is 5'11", 187 pounds, and he was drafted 89th overall in 2022. So the reason I wanted to highlight Milne is, again, I don't think he gets nearly enough love from people discussing our prospect pools, and he is, despite being a little bit undersized, he is a demon in the defensive zone. He's able to forecheck extremely well. He he's he's pretty, not surprisingly, but he's pretty quick. He's able to kind of make these or these offensive zone retrievals and defensive zone retrievals, and uh, he's just a fantastic player to watch, and he does have a little bit of scoring ability too. So I think he fits a similar, like kind of a similar mold to what I see Lorenz potentially being, but I think Milne is a little bit farther ahead than Lorenz is. And so, looking at his production, he's coming out of the WHL, 81 points in 68 games is pretty good, and obviously they're 19 points in the playoffs. And then he comes into Iowa, 13 points, 57 games in 22-23, 23-24 was 21 and 40. And then this year he's got 14 and 28. If he plays a full 68 games here, he'll end up with about 34. And so he's shown some pretty solid development there as a player. He's growing. He struggles a little bit with injuries, As you can see, he's hasn't played a full season in the AHL so far, but um, he's shown pretty consistent growth. And clearly the Minnesota Wild front office agree. They did call him up to the NHL this season, just for a game before he got sent back down. But I see him similar to Lorenz as a bottom six guy, but I think he plays a game pretty similar to what Kuznetsov is playing at the NHL right now, which is you know like just play strong, don't get penalized, and uh, just be a pretty consistent forechecker. And I think that's kind of the role that the Wild would like him to play. Um, and he's a little bit. Yeah, I think he's going to be a great player, and I think sooner rather than later we could see him getting more extended stints at the NHL level. So now we've made it to the fourth round, and the player that I would like to highlight here is Ryan Healy. He's a defender there for Harvard University. He is a right shot guy, and the Wild picked him 121st overall in the 2022 NHL draft. He's stands at 6 foot, 176 pounds, and he is a fantastically creative offensive defenseman. Um, he has a lot of upside as a power play quarterback. He's quick. He's got great edges, and he could be a pretty good power play quarterback at the NHL level. But might just be a guy that you would need to staple to someone a little bit better defensively. Um, he's a strong skater. He's able to change direction pretty quick. He's another guy that saw a nice sophomore bump to his play in that 23-24 season, um, and then has kind of fallen back to earth a little bit, but is still showing flashes of his previous play. So there for Harvard in 22-23 in 34 games, he had 8 points. And then his sophomore year in 29 games, he had 22. The thing I will note there is he was a minus 26. He did not play the greatest of defense, and still doesn't. It's starting to develop a bit more, but I think that's something that if he does want to make an impact at the NHL level, and even higher end at the AHL level, is something he would need to refine a bit more. But I think his main disadvantage, and then this year in 12 games he's got 4 points so far. But so the thing that I think Healy has going against him is he is a right shot defenseman. He plays on the right side. And that's a very, very congested part of our prospect pool. Obviously, for 3 NHL slots, you have a lot of high end talent that's in front of him, with guys like David Jiricek, Aaron Kiviharu, and like et cetera, et cetera. Some other guys we're going to talk about here. But so I think Healy comes in behind those guys. I think he's better offensively than a number of them and has the potential to be better offensively, but I think he is a guy that if he cannot refine his defensive play, then he might struggle to make an impact at the NHL level. I think he probably tops out as kind of a bottom pairing guy who brings a lot of offensive ability to that pairing, who can run a power play too. But I think he will really need to cook there in Iowa and develop those blue line skills to stick more at the NHL level. So at this point, we're going to be talking about the next 3 players, and I think all 3 of them are kind of massive steals for the Minnesota Wild. I think they are guys that probably could have gone a lot earlier, and they fell to the Wild. And I think they're all playing fantastic so far. So They're guys that I'm really excited about, and we're gonna hop into the round 5 pick here. So in the 5th round, the Minnesota Wild selected Aaron Pionk, 149th overall in 2023. The defender plays for the University of Minnesota Duluth. He is 6'1" and he plays on the left side, which is very, very good for him. Uh, he was an overage draftee. He's currently 21. But I think that spending that draft pick on an overage player was very, very warranted. Uh, he is the brother of Neil Pionk, the Winnipeg Jets defenseman, and he is a very, very solid player on both ends of the ice for Duluth. He's been productive at every single level of play the past few seasons. In 21-22, he had 28 points in 51 games in the NAHL. He jumps over to the USHL, has 36 points in 60 games and a plus 21. And then he hops into his first year at the University of Minnesota Duluth, 20 points, 37 games. Struggled a little bit defensively as a -9. But then this year, he's really been shining. 15 points, 18 games, and has been a far better defender than he was last year. And so he's a good. I think he's just an incredibly solid player. He's a good passer. He's a good poke checker. He's able to play with physicality without sacrificing some of the defensive positioning. He doesn't leave guys unmarked because he's chasing a check, which is really, really key for success there at the NHL level. And so, and then obviously, like I mentioned earlier, the bonus is that he plays the left side. It's a little bit weaker for the Wild in terms of their prospect pool. He's got a bit of an easier path to the NHL. And I think if he ends up being anything like Neil, it's an absolute steal of a 5th-round pick. But he seems to be developing really well into a two-way defender in his own right. So I think he tops out kind of in that bottom 4 on defense. He ends up being a guy who isn't nearly as flashy as a Buium or a Juracek, but I think will be quietly just a very solid, a very solid player, night in and night out, and a guy you really won't have to worry about wherever he ends up playing in the lineup. So for our 6th-round player, we have the guy that potentially might be my favorite out of this list in Callum Parker for the Calgary Hitmen in the WHL. He is a 6 foot, 187 pound right shot defender, and he was picked 181st overall in 2023. He's been a pretty consistent 30 to 40 point player in the WHL. He's constantly had to move between teams. Starts with the Victoria Royals, and then when they started to struggle, gets dealt to Moose Jaw. Then Moose Jaw starts to struggle, and he gets traded over to Calgary. He's very, very good. I think he's incredibly underrated. He, yeah, it's kind of hard to to highlight specific parts about his game because he just does everything so well. As Elite Prospects mentions, he forces dump-ins. He forces guys to the outside. He logs huge minutes with every single team. He was the alternate captain for Moose Jaw. He just plays very, very well on both ends of the ice. And, he's kind of refound his footing here after his draft year. He was picked in 2023, so he would have just been coming out of Victoria there in 68 games, 38 points, but was a -44 and was a -36 the year before that. And so I think the reason why he dropped was he didn't look the best defensively. I mean, he's getting shelled on the ice. And then the next season, he looks like it's going to be this more of the same with Victoria, and he goes to Moose Jaw in a trade and puts up 42 points in 63 games and is a plus 21 and has 9 points in 20 games for them in the playoffs. And so, really, really finds his footing defensively and is just a very strong player overall. And now, kind of this season, obviously starts in Moose Jaw wearing the A, 12 points, 19 games, and then gets dealt to Calgary and has 12 points in 16 games so far. He is projected to finish, again, pretty consistently with what he has in the past with 45 points in 66 games. And so, again, he's a guy who he just kind of does everything pretty solidly. There's not any huge gaps in his game. I don't think he's a guy who immediately goes from the W to the NHL, but I think, I think he gets into Iowa hopefully next year. Um, that would be my preference. And then he's a guy I can see being a top four defenseman in the future. He does everything so well, and for a fifth or a sixth round pick, sorry, he is an absolute steal in that position. And so, again, he's probably my favorite player on this list. I'm really excited to see where he ends up as an NHL player because from what I'm seeing right now, it's looking pretty nice. And rounding out our list with our seventh round pick, I believe is the only seventh round pick the Wild have made recently in Jimmy Clark. I will say, even if he wasn't the only seventh round pick, I would still talk about him because of his start to this season. Uh, it's been fantastic. So he is a 6 foot left shot winger, plays obviously left wing, and he was picked 213th overall. So kind of heading towards the tail end there of the draft class. But I think he is a fantastic player. Um, I think he's incredibly creative on offense. He passes really well. Um, but he never really flashed that on scorecards. And so his point production doesn't necessarily reflect, I think, the quality of player he is. And I think that offensive flair really started to show at the start of this year, which we'll talk about here in a second. But I think that's why the Minnesota native dropped to the seventh round. Um, so looking at his stats, 22-23, he played in the USHL, 47 points, 62 games. He plays for the U of M right now in the NCAA. In last year, he had 11 points, 39 games. Honestly, pretty solid for a seventh round pick. A lot of these guys don't turn out at all. Um, and so, even getting a guy that's putting up 11 points in 39 games, who has the skills that Clark does, is pretty good. And then this year, he was off to a tear to start the season. He was at like a point per game through I think the first 12. And then obviously going up here, his last five, he hasn't really done much. In his last 10, he's scored a goal. So he would have been at 12 points in 12 games to start the season. But the really, really key thing here is he is incredibly well disciplined as a forward. Last year, he only had 4 penalty minutes. This year, in 22 games, he has none. And so, uh, he, I think, kind of pans out as not as an all star by any stretch, but he's a guy, he's getting deployed in the bottom six at the U of M and is producing pretty well. He's disciplined. He's not going to take a lot of penalties. I don't think he turns into an all star, but I think he is in that category of guy that will be a very good AHL player who can kind of get called up and will add some offensive flair into that bottom six. Um, that is a good complement to guys who can more effectively drive play on their own on his line. He's doing that a bit right now at the U of M. At the start of the year, he was playing with Matthew Wood. I believe he still is. And so he's got better line mates this year. And I think if that trend continues a bit at the NHL level, that's a huge win of a seventh round pick. Um, and yeah, like I mentioned before, a lot of these guys don't pan out, but I can see Clark absolutely panning out and being successful, kind of like Sweeney was the last couple of years in Iowa. Just a very solid player, kind of a leader for the team. And then I believe he is with the Chicago Wolves now, but he was a great player, another later round draft pick, and uh, Clark I think could be kind of that same guy. So that is where our list ends. Let me know your thoughts on kind of my discussion of these guys. Do you think anyone kind of I missed in any of these rounds that could be good? Uh, Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed, make sure to hit like and subscribe. Thank you.